In the last section, we said that Kubernetes is a system for running many different types of containers over multiple machines, and we choose to use it if we have an application that specifically requires us to run multiple different types of containers. If you are planning on creating an application that would largely just have one type of container inside of it, Kubernetes might not be the best solution for you. Now, in this section, we're going to continue a little bit more by talking about how we use Kubernetes in a development or production environment, and then we're going to start setting up Kubernetes on our local machine. All right. So when we work with Kubernetes, there is a very large distinction between using it in a development environment, as in on your local computer, and in a production environment, where you would expect some outside traffic or users to visit your application. In a development environment, we make use of Kubernetes by using a program called Minikube. Minikube is a command line tool whose sole purpose is going to be to set up a tiny little Kubernetes cluster, like the one you see right here, on your local computer. We'll talk about what Minikube does in just a little bit, but for right now, just understand that it's a program that is used to set up Kubernetes on your local machine. When we start using Kubernetes in a production capacity, we very frequently make use of what are called managed solutions. Managed solutions are references to outside cloud providers such as Google Cloud or Amazon AWS that will set up an entire Kubernetes cluster for you and take care of a lot of very low-level tasks that are required to get everything working the way you expect in a secure fashion. And so if you're making use of Kubernetes on AWS, you would be making use of something called Amazon's Elastic Container Service with Kubernetes, which is abbreviated as EKS. And if you make use of it on Google Cloud, you would be making use of something called Kubernetes Engine, or GKE for short. You always also have the option to set up a Kubernetes cluster on your own as a sort of do-it-yourself option. And so you do not have to use these managed solutions that set up everything for you. But when you're first getting started with Kubernetes, it's without a doubt far easier to go with one of these managed solutions until you actually really have a deep understanding of Kubernetes and how it all works together. All right, so the big takeaway in this section is that in a development environment, you and I are going to be making use of something called Minikube. In a production environment, we very frequently make use of these managed solutions. Now we're going to start installing Kubernetes on our local machine in the next section, but before we do, I want to tell you just a little bit more about the setup process. So again, when you're developing locally, you're going to be making use of a program called Minikube. Minikube is going to create a Kubernetes cluster on your local machine. And so behind the scenes, it's essentially going to create a virtual machine whose sole purpose is going to be to run some number of containers. Minikube is a program that is used to create this virtual machine or this single node on your computer. In order to interact with this thing, you and I are going to be using a program called kubectl. kubectl is the program that is used to interact with a Kubernetes cluster in general and manage what all the different nodes are doing and what different containers they are running. So the reason I'm showing you this diagram right here is that we're going to start using a lot of different programs to work with Kubernetes, and it's going to very quickly become a little bit confusing as to what program is doing what. And so as everything moves forward from this point on, I want you to remember that we use kubectl anytime that we want to tell a virtual machine or a node what set of containers it's supposed to be running, or essentially manage what the node is doing. And we use the program Minikube just to create and run a Kubernetes cluster on your local machine. When you start moving to a production environment, this Minikube thing down here falls away. So we only make use of Minikube in a local environment. However, kubectl is going to be a program that you use both locally and production. So even when you start to deploy your application on a Kubernetes cluster off to, say, Google Cloud, we will continue to use kubectl. All right. So here's what we're going to do to set up Kubernetes on our local machine. We're going to first install that kubectl program. We then have to install a virtual machine driver that's going to allow us to create that virtual machine that we mentioned just a second ago on your local computer. Now, I want you to remember back to our entire discussion about Docker a long time ago. You'll recall that we had said that when we installed Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, it was technically creating a virtual machine at the same time. So that's essentially the same thing that's happening in the world of Kubernetes. The only difference is that Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows install that virtual machine for you and all the associated software with it. In the world of Kubernetes, not quite so automatic. You and I have to install a little bit of software that's going to allow Kubernetes to create, or Minikube in this case, to create a virtual machine for you. Now, to install this virtual machine, we're going to be installing a program in particular called VirtualBox. So after we install kubectl and VirtualBox, we're then going to install Minikube. Again, this is the piece of software that it allows you to create a Kubernetes installation on your local computer. All right, so that's it. Let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to start going through this setup process on Mac OS and Windows. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.